Apache woman closed her eyes to die and woke up, bound in a cowboy's bed. The godless canyon reeked of hopelessness, deceit, and a suppressed grief Jonah Creech knew like his own scarred hands. He moved through the carnage of the settler wagon, his eyes cold as flint, his face a stone mask revealing nothing. Smoke and lies choked the air. Then he saw her, the Apache woman Tala, unconscious amidst the slaughter, a bloody knife still clutched in her hand. To his cynical eyes, she wasn't a survivor. She was the serpent in the garden, a true bad egg left behind after the strike. The sight clawed at a deeper wound, the ghost of his own family's bloody end, twisting his gut into a cold knot of vengeance. There would be no mercy. He'd haul her in and let the law sort her out. He slung her over his horse, not out of compassion, but for a hangman's justice. This wasn't a rescue. It was a reckoning. And she had just closed her eyes to die, only to wake up as the prisoner of the one man who would see her hang. He's chained a survivor, believing she's a savage. Is this the cold justice of the unforgiving West, or the first mistake on a trail to his own damnation? Tell me your gut feeling in the comments below. Smash that like button if this brutal beginning has your heart pounding, and share this tale with anyone who knows that the line between hero and villain is thinner than a razor's edge. Subscribe now and ring that iron notification bell, because in the next part, the silence in that lonely cabin will be broken. The first thing that returned was the pain. A hot, tearing agony in her side where the world had ripped open. The second was the smell, dry hay, stale dust, and the unfamiliar scent of a white man's sweat. Tala's eyes snapped open. This was not the spirit world. The light was a single dusty blade cutting through the gloom of a rough-hewn shed. She was on a pile of straw, a coarse blanket thrown over her. And a man stood silhouetted against the open door, his form blocking out the vast, indifferent sky. He was a tall man, built of the same hard, unforgiving lines as the land itself, his face a roadmap of harsh winters and desperate skirmishes. Jonah Creech. He saw the moment life returned to her eyes. The unfocused glaze of near death sharpened into a black, bottomless well of hatred. He had seen that look before. He had earned it. "You're awake," he stated, his voice a low gravel devoid of warmth. He stepped inside, letting the door swing shut, plunging them into shadow. The sound of a heavy wooden bar sliding into place was as final as a judge's gavel. She pushed herself up, a gasp of pain catching in her throat, her eyes darting to the rawhide strip binding her wrists. A prisoner. Her gaze flew back to him, filled with the fire of a cornered wolf. "Where are the others?" Jonah asked, his voice flat. He was a man who traded in consequences, his soul as worn as the leather of his boots. Tala remained silent. Her silence was a fortress, the only weapon she had left. He took a step closer, his shadow swallowing her. "Your war party, the ones who hit that wagon. Where did they ride? Nothing. Only the ragged sound of her breathing and the defiant glare that promised murder if she were free." He saw the serpent. He saw the sin. It was a classic case of opportunism, he told himself, a savage getting ideas above her station. The lie settled easily, a comfortable coat against the chill of a memory he refused to face. "Suit yourself," he grunted, turning away. "You'll talk when the law gets a hold of you." He tossed a small water skin near her feet. It landed with a dull thud. "Don't die before then. You're worth more alive." The casual cruelty of the words hung in the air, thicker than the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light. She didn't look at the water. She only watched him, her mind racing, assessing the cage, the captor, the impossible odds. She saw his torn uniform shirt, the weary set of his shoulders. She saw a soldier, an enemy. Later, as the sun began to bleed out across the mesas, painting the clouds in hues of impossible purple and gold, the fever took her. A tremor racked her body. Jonah, watching from the doorway of his main cabin, cursed under his breath. A dead Indian was worthless. He entered the shed again, this time with a bucket of water and clean rags. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, a faint, earthy aroma like damp soil and crushed herbs that clung to her. He knelt, his movements economical, impersonal. He had to clean the gash in her side. As he cut away the torn buckskin, he saw the wound clearly for the first time. It wasn't a clean shot. It was jagged, brutal, a defensive wound. And beneath it, he saw older bruises, the faint yellow and purple shadows of a struggle, a flicker of something, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor beneath the armor he wore disturbed him. The evidence in his mind began to fray at the edges. He worked in silence, his rough hands surprisingly steady as he cleaned the wound. She bore the pain without a sound. Her jaw clenched, her eyes screwed shut. But when his fingers brushed against her arm, she flinched, not from pain, but from the touch itself. It was a touch that had only ever brought her violence. When he was done, he stood up, the silence between them no longer empty but heavy, a dense unspoken barrier built of prejudice and a new unsettling doubt. Night fell, and with it came the wind. It whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying the names of the dead. Jonah sat on his porch, rifle across his knees, the shed a dark blot against the star-dusted sky. He had caged a killer, he told himself. He had done his duty. But as the coyote moon rose, casting long, skeletal shadows across the land, he couldn't shake the question that had burrowed deep into his gut. The wound, the bruises, the absolute unbroken defiance in her eyes. He had chained a wolf, believing she was the hunter. And as the wind howled its mournful song, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one trapped on the wrong side of the door. The morning broke cold and sharp, washing the high desert in a clean, unforgiving light. The wind had died, leaving a silence that was heavier than the storm it replaced. Jonah entered the shed, the scent of pine and his own boiling coffee doing little to cut the thick tension within. Tala was awake, propped against the far wall, her eyes tracking his every move. They were the eyes of an animal that had known the trap its entire life. He set a tin plate of jerky and hardtack on the floor, sliding it toward her with the toe of his boot. An offering fit for a prisoner. "You got a name?" He asked, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He had never asked a bounty their name before. They were cargo, consequences, not people. Her gaze remained locked on his, unwavering. She ignored the food completely. A long moment stretched, punctuated only by the buzz of a lone fly near the single grimy window. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low murmur like the rustle of dry leaves, yet it held the sharp edge of flint. Why does the hunter need to know the name of his prey? The question, a perfect arrow, struck the very heart of his own unspoken doubt. It left him without an answer. He was a man carved from cynicism, but her unbroken dignity was a language he was beginning to understand. He scoffed, a raw, cynical sound that tasted of dust and disbelief, and turned away, the conversation over before it began. The day wore on a slow, agonizing crawl toward a justice he was no longer certain of. He watched her from a distance, a silent, grim silhouette. She did not eat. She did not drink. She simply sat, a pillar of exhausted defiance, on his doorstep, gathering her strength. By midday, the fever had returned with a vengeance. He saw it first in the slight tremor of her hands, then the sheen of sweat on her brow despite the cool air in the shed. Soon, her body was racked with violent shivers, her teeth chattering a frantic, desperate rhythm against the oppressive quiet. Jonah watched his jaw tight. This was the poison of the wound, a fire that would consume her from within. He could let it burn out. Let the desert claim what was already lost. But the memory of the gash, the defensive tear, the bruises gnawed at him. And another memory, deeper and more painful, of a small body, hot with fever, that he had been helpless to save. Damnation, he swore the word, a plume of white dissolving in the cold air. He worked with a grim precision he thought he had lost forever. He gathered herbs from a worn leather pouch, the kind his own grandmother used to use, crushing them into a dark, gritty slurry. He forced the bitter medicine between Tala's lips, then set about cleaning the wound again, his touch rough but methodical. She was lost in the haze, adrift in a burning sea of memory and pain. She began to murmur the words, a soft, guttural river of her native tongue. He didn't understand the language, but he understood the cadence. It was a lament, a story of loss. He heard the sorrow of a woman running of a fire, of a cry cut short. Then a single word sliced through the delirium, a name spoken in a clear, heartbroken whisper. Coda. The name hit him like a physical blow. It was not a warrior's name. It was the name of a child, her son. In that instant, the mask of the savage, the raider, the bad egg dissolved. All he saw was a mother grieving her lost boy. The ghost in his own soul, the one he kept chained in the deepest, darkest cellar of his memory, roared in recognition. He saw his own wife's face, his own daughter's eyes. The air in the shed became a prison of smells, the sharp scent of herbs, the metallic tang of blood, and the sour, suffocating scent of his own regret. He recoiled as if struck. And in that precise moment of shared silent agony, a new sound drifted on the wind. It was faint but clear. Not the cry of a hawk or the howl of a wolf. It was the sharp metallic call of a cavalry bugle. The sound, once a symbol of order and duty, was now a promise of violence. It was the call of the wolf pack closing in for the kill. And suddenly, staring at the feverish woman on the floor, Jonah Creech wasn't sure if he was the hunter or the bait. The bugle's echo died, but the sound remained a splinter of glass in Jonah's memory. He moved with the fluid grace of a seasoned warrior, a phantom limb twitching to life. The heavy bar of his cabin door slammed home the sound, a declaration of war against the approaching daylight. He grabbed his Winchester, the worn steel a cold, familiar comfort against the sudden heat of his fear. This was not the measured approach of the law. This was the silent, circling patience of wolves. From the shed, Tala watched him through a crack in the rough-hewn planks. The fever had receded, leaving her weak but lucid. She saw his movements, not of a captor preparing to deliver his prize, but of a soldier preparing for a siege. A new terror, sharp and cold, pierced through her grief. What enemy was coming that was worse than the man who already held her chained? He burst back into the shed, his face a mask of grim urgency. "How many?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "How many soldiers attacked your people before you found that wagon?" Tala recoiled the question, a fresh slash on a raw wound. She saw only an accuser trying to wring a confession from her. "I am not a killer," she whispered in her tongue, the words a prayer of defiance. "I don't have time for this," he snarled, his gaze sweeping the horizon from the shed's single opening. His eyes landed on a small, worn wooden chest tucked into the corner, the one place he kept the ghosts of his own past locked away. Her gaze had lingered there before. "You stay away from that," he said, his voice dropping, edged with a pain so sharp it was almost a physical threat. The accusation in his tone broke her stoic silence. "You hide your trophies from the slaughter," she shot back in broken English, her voice laced with venom. "Like the men who took my son." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. The rigid walls he had built around his heart crumbled into dust. "Trophies?" He choked out a harsh, broken sound that was half laugh, half sob. He stumbled toward the chest, kicking it open. The contents spilled onto the dusty floor. Not scalps, not medals. A small, faded, corn-husk doll. And a single tiny leather moccasin. "My family." He said the words torn from a place of profound, unhealed grief. "My wife Sarah. My girl Leah." He stared at the pathetic treasures, his mind thrown back in time. They weren't killed in a raid. He rasped the confession, costing him everything. They were murdered by white men, men who wanted the land, who wanted an excuse for a war. They left Apache arrows in the dirt to sell their lie. They burned my home to the ground and called it savagery, so they could answer with their own. The story hung in the air, a poisonous vapor connecting the two sides of a war he now understood was built on lies. Tala stared not at him, but at the doll. She saw not the pain of her enemy, but the universal grief of a parent. The hatred in her eyes, a fire that had kept her alive, softened, replaced by the ashen gray of shared understanding. A fragile bridge connecting their disparate worlds. She touched a thin white scar on her own forearm. My village. She whispered the words barely audible. A bluecoat major. He promised peace. Then the guns came. Coda, my son. He was the same age as your Leah. The shared wound, raw and bleeding, silenced them both. Jonah was shaken from his reverie by a glint of light on the ridge. A spyglass. A single rider watching them with unnerving stillness. A military scout. And Jonah recognized the man's horse, the cut of his saddle. It was a man from Major Alistair Finch's own company. The chilling realization washed over him. The dead settlers. The lone Apache survivor. The convenient arrival of a cavalry unit known for its brutality. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a cover-up. He'd seen this setup before, orders that reeked of politics of pawns placed to fail. Tala wasn't just a scapegoat for the wagon attack. She was the last witness to a different, greater crime, and Finch was here to bury the story. And now so was he. He turned from the window, the last of his doubt burned away by a cold, righteous fury. He strode toward Tala. She tensed, seeing the fire in his eyes, expecting the final blow. He pulled his heavy hunting knife from its sheath. She braced herself, a silent prayer on her lips. With a single decisive slash, he cut the rawhide ropes binding her wrists. The snap of the leather echoed in the sudden, profound silence. He pressed the hilt of her own bloody knife back into her hand. Her fingers closed around the familiar grip. He looked her in the eye, no longer captor to prisoner, but soldier to soldier. Major Finch doesn't leave witnesses. He said, his voice flat and hard as iron. He thinks you're the last one. He's wrong. We ride at midnight. Midnight was a shroud of cold stars and whispered secrets. They moved like phantoms, melting into the landscape that had once been Jonah's prison and was now their only sanctuary. The open prairie stretched before them in every direction, a vast, indifferent sea of pale grass under a sky that offered no comfort and no cover. Jonah led his old instincts as an army scout, flaring to life, his movements a silent language of survival, as he guided them over rock to hide their tracks from the dust. He was a man running directly into the heart of a new and present hell. Tala followed a shadow within his shadow, her steps as light and sure as a whisper on the wind. She read the land not as a map of threats and cover, but as a living thing, a place of spirits and stories. He would watch her pause, her head cocked, listening to something he couldn't hear before pointing to a new path, a safer path. A quiet, unspoken accord was formed between them, forged in shared danger. By the second day, their water was gone. The sun was a merciless hammer beating down from a brass sky. Jonah's throat was a desert of its own, and he saw the faint tremor in Tala's hands. His military knowledge was useless here. This was a place of slow, agonizing death for those caught in its unforgiving embrace. He slumped against a sun-bleached boulder to feed a bitter taste in his mouth. "It's no good," he rasped. "The creek bed's been dry for a year." Tala said nothing. She scanned the horizon, her eyes not on the cracked earth but on the unassuming green weeds clinging to the base of the mesa. Here, she said, her voice dry but firm. She knelt and began to dig with her bare hands at the base of the plants. "There's nothing there," Jonah started to say, but fell silent. Cool, clean water was seeping from the damp soil beneath. The roots always seek clean water, she explained, offering him the first handful. He hesitated. The man who had slid a plate of food to her with his boot now looked at the life-giving water offered in her hands. The irony was a bitter taste. He drank the water, a cool absolution washing away more than just the dust. In that moment, he was not her captor. She was not his prisoner. They were simply two souls adrift and surviving. Their fragile truce was shattered by the glint of a spyglass from a distant ridge. Jonah threw them flat behind the rocks, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pulled out his own looking-glass. It was Finch's patrol. They moved with the slow, deliberate, confident purpose of hunters who had found the trail of their prey. But they weren't just following. They were flanking, pushing them west. A cold dread settled in Jonah's gut. "He's not tracking us." He breathed the words tasting like ash. "He's hurting us." Finch was using the land against them, funneling them toward a destination of his choosing. The vast open prison of the prairie had suddenly become a killing floor. They ran fueled by the last dregs of their adrenaline, the knowledge of the closing trap, a spur in their sides. The open plains gave way to a dark, jagged line etched into the landscape, a ravine. It was their only chance. They scrambled down the steep, shale-covered slope, tumbling into a narrow-shadowed world. The walls of the arroyo rose 20 feet on either side, steep and impassable. They had found shelter from view, but they had also walked into their own grave. They followed the winding path deeper, the sense of escape slowly curdling into one of claustrophobia. The canyon walls seemed to press in the sky, shrinking to a thin, mocking ribbon of blue. They rounded a final sharp bend, and the path ended. A sheer wall of rock rose before them. A dead end. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing. They were trapped. A voice amplified by the canyon walls echoed down from above. It was smooth, confident, and dripping with the satisfaction of a game well played. It was Major Finch. Nowhere left to run, Creech, the voice boomed a chilling parody of their first encounter. "A lot of trouble for a simple runaway. You should have stayed buried with your ghosts. I do admire a good hunt. And this one has come to a very satisfying end." Major Finch's words hung in the canyon air, a death sentence delivered with the casual arrogance of a god. Below, in the belly of the stone beast, Jonah Creech felt the world narrow to a single sharp point of focus. The fear was gone, burned away by the cold, clear fire of a man with nothing left to lose. He was no longer the hunted. He was the cornered wolf, and this grave would not be his. He looked at Tala. The stoic mask had fallen, replaced by a fierce, defiant resolve that mirrored his own. There was no need for words. Their shared pasts, their shared grief had forged an accord deeper than language. They knew what had to be done. "He's too proud to shoot us from up there," Jonah whispered, his voice a low command. "He'll send his men down. He'll want to see this finished up close." Tala's eyes scanned the fractured canyon wall beside them. She pointed to a section of the cliff that was deeply undercut, a ton of rock and shale held in place by a few key, precariously balanced stones. A deadfall. A patient, silent beast of gravity. Jonah nodded, understanding instantly. They were not sheep waiting for the slaughter. They were building their own tombstone, hoping to drop it on their executioners. They worked with a frantic, silent energy, their hands raw and bleeding, their breath tearing at their lungs. It was a desperate prayer made of sweat and stone. As they wedged the final rock into place, they heard the crunch of boots on the gravel below. They were coming. Jonah and Tala melted back into a crevice on the opposite wall, the silence a new kind of torture. 3 soldiers entered the canyon's narrow throat, their rifles held ready, their faces grim. Among them was the young trooper Jonah had seen before, a boy with soft eyes who looked as if he did not belong in this land of casual slaughter. The soldiers moved cautiously, step by agonizing step, deeper into the kill zone. Jonah held his breath, his finger ghosting the trigger of his Winchester. Not yet. He waited, his entire being coiled like a rattlesnake ready to strike. The lead soldier passed the invisible line. Now Jonah roared. Tala, with a strength born of desperation, threw her weight against the keystone. It teetered for a heart-stopping second, and then it gave way. The world dissolved into a deafening roar of grinding, shattering rock. A river of stone and dust thundered down the slope, a man-made avalanche that slammed into the canyon floor. Two of the soldiers were swept away, their cries swallowed by the chaos. The canyon entrance was sealed, a tomb of their own making. From the ridge above, Finch screamed in rage. In the thick, choking cloud of dust, the young trooper Evans scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of pale, dawning horror. He saw Finch take aim at Jonah's exposed position, and the boy broke. He let out a yell and fired his rifle into the air, stumbling backward as if he'd tripped. "They're up here," he screamed, creating a fatal moment of confusion. Finch whirled his attention, diverted his own men, now a liability. It was the only chance Jonah would get. He fired not at Finch, but at the rock just above him. Stone shrapnel exploded, forcing the major back from the ledge. Finch, Jonah's voice boomed, echoing with the authority of a man who had faced death and found his purpose. "This ends now. Your lies are buried." "You sentimental fool. Creech." Finch roared back, his face a mask of white-hot fury. "You could have had a quiet life. You chose to side with a savage over your own kind. She's more human than you'll ever be." Jonah yelled, the truth of it ringing in his own ears. "You burn homes and murder children for a few acres of dust and call it progress. You built your hope on their despair." Finch rose from behind his cover, his pistol barking fire. A bullet tore through the flesh of Jonah's shoulder, a searing, white-hot pain. He staggered but did not fall. He raised his Winchester, the world narrowing to the man on the ridge, the ghost of his past, the demon of his present. He saw his wife's face. He saw his daughter's eyes. He saw Coda's name whispered in a fever dream. He fired. The shot was true. Major Alistair Finch stood for a moment, a look of profound shock and disbelief etched on his face, a small dark hole appearing on his chest. Then he crumpled his body, tumbling from the ridge, a final graceless descent into the chaos he had created. He landed in the dust of the canyon floor, a broken testament to his own greed. Silence. The roar of the rock slide faded, leaving only the ringing in Jonah's ears. The dust began to settle, revealing the aftermath of their desperate gambit. The monster was dead. Jonah sagged against the rock wall, the strength draining out of him, the pain in his shoulder, a screaming reminder that he was alive. Tala rushed to his side, her eyes wide, reflecting not just terror, but a flicker of awe. The monster was dead, buried in a tomb of his own making. But as Jonah looked at the path leading out of the canyon, a path now stained with the blood of soldiers, he knew their war wasn't over. They had won their lives, but they had just declared war on the United States Army. And the wilderness ahead was the only ally they had left. The dust settled like a shroud in the quiet canyon, coating the living and the dead alike. The sharp, final crack of Jonah's rifle had given way to a ringing silence, profound and heavy. The battle was over. The monster was dead, but victory felt like a hollow, aching thing in Jonah's chest. He sagged against the blood-streaked rock, the fire in his shoulder a screaming testament to the price of their survival. He pushed himself to his feet, his gaze finding Tala. She stood over the body of one of Finch's soldiers, her expression not triumphant, but filled with a quiet, immeasurable sorrow. She took no joy in this death. She was a survivor, not a conqueror, and in her solemn stillness Jonah saw a strength that shamed his own quest for vengeance. They moved through the quiet carnage, a grim and silent accounting. They were bruised, exhausted, and a long way from anything that felt like home. The war against Finch was won, but their war for a place in this world had only just begun. Your shoulder Tala said, her voice soft in the stillness. It was the first time she had spoken to him with something other than defiance or desperation. It was a simple statement of fact, an acknowledgement of his pain. He looked down at the torn, bloody fabric. "It's nothing. It is not nothing," she countered, her gaze steady. "A poison from a bullet is the same as a poison from a snake. It must be drawn out." In the shelter of a shallow overhang, he sat, the hard shell of his self-reliance finally broken. He let her work. Her touch was gentle, professional, her fingers surprisingly deft as she cleaned the wound with water from a fallen soldier's canteen and packed it with a poultice of herbs he didn't recognize. The cool balm soothed the fire in his flesh, but it was her quiet presence that began to soothe the deeper ache in his soul. "You should have run!" He rasped, his voice rough with pain and an emotion he couldn't name. "When that young trooper gave you the chance, you could have been free." Tala paused, her dark eyes meeting his. For a long moment she said nothing. "My people do not leave their warriors to die alone on the battlefield," she whispered. The word warriors struck him with a quiet force. She was not just acknowledging him as an ally. She was naming him as one of her own, bridging the vast, bloody chasm that had separated their worlds with a single powerful thread of respect. He had taken her as a prisoner, and she was now freeing him from a prison of his own making. He reached out, taking a strip of clean cloth and gently dabbing at a cut on her cheek, a small, simple act of care. It was not pity. It was not forgiveness. It was something far more powerful. It was solidarity. As the first pale fingers of dawn stretched over the canyon rim, they prepared to leave. They took the outlaws' horses, their guns, and their water. They found the young trooper Evans slumped behind a rock, his face pale, but his eyes alive. He had survived. He watched them approach, not with fear, but with a weary understanding. Jonah walked over, placed a full canteen beside him, and gave a slow, solemn nod, a gesture of acceptance across the veil of worlds that had divided them. The boy nodded back. No words were needed. They mounted their new horses, their movements stiff and aching. They rode out of the canyon's mouth, leaving the ghosts and the greed behind them buried in a tomb of stone. Before them, the wilderness stretched out a vast, beautiful, and terrifying promise of freedom. "Where do we go?" Tala asked, her voice carried on the clean morning wind. Jonah looked at the endless horizon, then at the woman beside him. He thought of his quest for a hangman's justice, of the cold emptiness that had driven him. That man was dead, buried back in the canyon with Finch. A new man, raw and uncertain, sat in the saddle. "Somewhere they won't find us," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Somewhere north. Somewhere a man and a woman can build a life, not just a grave." He didn't know if such a place existed. The road ahead was unwritten. But as they walked into the morning light, their faces set toward the future, he was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man riding toward a future he never thought he'd have. He looked at Tala, her profile etched against the rising sun, her presence a silent promise that even in a godless land, a man could find something worth fighting for. A reason to greet the dawn.